Hello and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define your family. This is Julia, your host, and today I want to introduce you to Elizabeth Carr. Elizabeth is widely known as the first baby in the U.S. born as a result of IVF treatment. In fact, she's the first baby born as a result of a medicated IVF treatment. That is astounding. So at 41 years old, she's the first child whose parents went through IVF successfully and created a baby. This has made her a spokesperson for IVF her entire life. And we're going to hear a lot about what it was like to be that spokesperson, that role model, that first, what it was like for her parents to embark on a fertility journey that was largely unknown at the time. I mean, I want you to imagine that you are told that this is the end of your family building journey, period, end of story. Except that there may be one doctor in the entire country who might be doing this very controversial thing that is illegal in certain states, including the state that you reside in. And maybe, just maybe, by some miracle of science, that doctor might be able, or that clinic might be able to help you. Crazy, right? We owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Carr family and their doctors and Elizabeth for being the first, because their trailblazing is what has enabled fertility journeys, IVF, IUI, which is what I did, and so many other types of fertility journeys which are made possible by science, because they chose to take that leap into the unknown, because they chose to say, I'm going to try this thing that has never really been done. That is huge. And it's not something that lives only 41 years ago. What I mean by that is it's not that we take this leap, this moment in science that is this progressive movement forward and we say, okay, we're done. We've moved science along. Now we can all have fertility journeys. We can all have access to IVF. No, in fact, our access to IVF is as a result of continued scientific progression, continued scientific advancements and improvement for which we owe a host of scientific researchers and doctors and patients everywhere. It's also due to patients asking difficult questions, and it's due to advocacy. People like Elizabeth who are willing to say, this is worth it. This is not our scientists or our doctors playing God. This is not something evil. This is not something that is inappropriate or should be restricted legally. This is something that gives us access to having wonderful families and to creating wonderful humans. I was just so excited to do this episode. I've been waiting to talk to Elizabeth for years now, and she is more remarkable than I could have ever imagined. So take a listen. You don't have to trust me on that. Take a listen for yourself. Here's Elizabeth. If you love her story, and if you feel strongly that IVF is something that we should advocate for, that we should make available to more families, make it more affordable, more accessible, more realistic, then please share this episode with a friend. And don't forget to rate Stork'd wherever you listen to podcasts. There's also a newsletter. Sign up for that. And I hope you enjoy. Here is Elizabeth. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. And I've been following your story for years. I mean, you've been in the news, obviously, your entire life. And so it's such a pleasure to finally get to connect and to learn more about your experience in a family that was at the very beginning of this family building movement. And you are now front and center talking about it in a lot of really interesting ways through your book, through your podcast, through your speaking engagement. So there's a lot we're going to uncover today. But before we get started, all that good stuff, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's really fun to be here. My day job is I'm actually the director of commercial development at a pre-implantation genetic testing company who is called Genomic Prediction, and our product is LifeView testing. So we do all sorts of pre-implantation genetic tests. And then, my personal life, obviously, everybody knows me as the first IVF baby, but I'm also a mom to a 12-year-old boy, also, a wife. I'm also a dog mom to a beagle who I'm pretty sure is convinced thinks she's a person. And I'm also an endurance runner and marathoner. So have lots of different hobbies and things that fulfill me. So,
oh, that's awesome. Now, I'm going to ask you to do one small adjustment, which is if we just move your hair
Oh, sure. Is it on the mic?
It's on the mic. Yeah.
Yep.
Otherwise awesome. It's funny. I was talking to my coworker who claims I am not a marathoner. That's what she says about herself. I'm not a marathoner as she trains for her 6th marathon. And there's something about the endurance marathoning community that's really interesting and really intriguing. Is there anything you want to say about your marathoning or your endurance work as sort of it relates to who you are as a person?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's why I got into running is because I'm inherently not good at it. I am not fast. I do not have natural talent. It is something that I have to continually work at. And I think that's why I love it, right? It pushes me to keep moving forward and get better. And despite all of the challenges and adversity, just like the, family building world or infertility or fertility journey, we figure out a way to keep going. And sometimes the keep going doesn't look the way we thought it would, but nothing stops us.
I see. I love that analogy because you're right. There is something unstoppable or really creative about the people who go through complicated family building journeys, right? You have to think about, how am I going to take this next hill? How am I going to preserve my energy so I can get to mile 26 or 100 or whatever it is that you're on? I'm probably going to beat this analogy to death, but it strikes me that your parents were sort of at the end of their marathon, so to speak. They were going over Heartbreak Hill, if you're in Boston, going through the Boston Marathon, the really tough stuff and the exhausting stuff. And then they ended up finding IVF. Can you talk to us a little bit about their story? And then we're really going to spend most of the time on your story, but I want to hear about their story as well, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously my parents, knew right away when they got married that they wanted to start having children. My mother was a teacher and an educator. My dad came from, a family of 4 kids. So they had always had aspirations to have a lot of kids. And it turned out, my mother could get pregnant quite easily, but she couldn't stay pregnant. And what I mean by that is she kept having ectopic pregnancies, which, if you know anything about ectopic pregnancies, they're very dangerous.
Really dangerous.
Basically internally bleed to death if they're not taken care of. So she actually had 3 ectopic pregnancies, which is just mind blowing to think about her going through that. Yeah. And after the 3rd one, her OBGYN actually said, I think we need to have your fallopian tubes removed. And that was kind of a gut punch to them because that really meant, oh, well, that seems like kind of a critical piece if we want to have a child, right? We need the fallopian tubes are kind of critical in the plumbing department. Yeah. So what are we going to do here? And it turned out that her infertility wasn't caused by, typical causes of infertility. It was actually caused by scar tissue from a botched appendix surgery when she was in her teens. Wow. And so all that scar tissue, they just basically made it, really difficult for things to happen in the way we anticipate in the medical world. So by the time she had her 3rd ectopic pregnancy and had the fallopian tubes removed, she went to the OBGYN and had a follow-up appointment with him. And he said, I just came back from this conference where they talked about this thing called IVF, and it worked in England. And there's a group in Norfolk, Virginia that said they're going to start a program. And he literally just gave her a 1-page flyer and said, this is all I know. Why don't you contact them? And that was it.
Wow. Wow. So I think about now, right? And those people who go through IVF, there's a lot of information out there. There's Google, there's friends, there's podcasts like these, there's your work, your book, etc. So there's reference points to understand it. And even still, it can feel, one of the criticisms of IVF is that you can feel like you're flying blind, like you really don't know what's going to happen to your body, what's going to happen to your family. But I just imagine being at the forefront of science and getting a 1-pager where your doctor's even like, I don't know, and how exciting, thrilling, scary, weird that must have been for them.
Oh, absolutely. I think my parents have always said that they almost feel lucky in a way that there wasn't this overwhelming amount of information because they always said, we were better off not knowing what we didn't know, in terms of, they had no idea that, first of all, they had no idea that they were going to be the first to be successful in the United States. There were, several other couples going through this like pilot program at the time down there. And they didn't, nobody knew what protocol was going to work. It was, everybody was rooting for each other, but they really didn't have a clear sense of like what even to expect, what steps were going to be next, what would happen. And it was all just kind of taking it one day and one step at a time. So in a way, they always said it was better they didn't know. Of course, now there's so much information that you're right. It can be overwhelming, but I also feel like, I want everybody to know all of the options before they even need them, before they even get to a point where they're seeing a fertility specialist.
Totally. Yeah. And so obviously it worked. You're here talking to us, which is just amazing. Have they shared at all about the experience of like discovering that the pregnancy had worked, or having you, like, what was their experience with this, ultimately this miracle, the scientific revolution?
Yeah. So there's a funny story that on the day of my mother's transfer, first of all, let's go back. Remember, this was 41 years ago. So first of all, the technology had never been successful in the United States yet. Secondly, this was the first time that they were doing hormone protocols, because IVF in England, Louise Brown, who's a good friend of mine, was actually through a natural cycle. So this was the first time they were actually going through what we now know as modern IVF, right? All the hormone protocols and all that stuff. So this was discovered and kind of figured out by the doctors, that my mother had. And so on her transfer day, there were only 2 embryos. They only got 2 embryos, which if you think about that, first of all, is crazy. And of course, we didn't have pre-implantation genetic testing. We didn't have all the technology to like measure all these levels and, all the tests that we have now. And so they just literally looked through a Nikon microscope and went, this one looks better than this one, like shape wise. Okay, well, this one's prettier, so we're going to use this one. So they put one embryo back. That was it. That's me. And so on her transfer day, it was her birthday.
Whoa.
They came in singing happy birthday and happy transfer day. And they had brought her a cupcake to mark the occasion. And so yeah, it was very memorable for them. And then of course, they waited to find out. And the funniest part is, because IVF was actually illegal in Massachusetts, where my parents were from, they had to keep going down to Virginia for all these tests and procedures and whatnot. And on one trip, my dad had to go on a work trip. And so she traveled alone. This was in the very early stages of the pregnancy. And he was home in Massachusetts, and a newspaper ran the headline, "Barren woman impregnated." And my dad went, "Oh my God, that's my wife." And so like, that's basically how they figured out it was successful. They obviously had told my parents, but my dad, that's what it really hit home for him. It's like he was reading a newspaper headline about his own wife. So
I think what's so interesting about this story is how much news there is, right? You can look up miracle baby, barren woman, all these things that are big headline news and news moment. And you are front and center, this cherubic, like chubby, adorable little baby on these covers of these magazines. So it was very much a big deal in the scientific community and the family building community. I mean, you were like this poster child for what could be for families, what could be for science. That's huge. In some ways, you were a celebrity. In some ways, you could have grown up in Hollywood and been on commercials in the same level of celebrity. What was it like to grow up being the miracle baby or the first ever IVF baby? What was that like to be in the news all the time?
It was simultaneously wonderful and awful.
Yeah.
That's just the truth. I obviously learned about my birth from a very early age. I mean, I joke, but I'm not actually joking. My first press conference was at 3 days old. And so I feel like I've always known how I came into this world. But by the same token, I went back to the clinic where I was born basically every year until I was in my late teens. And they would run tests and do follow-ups to make sure that I was quote unquote normal, right? Because we didn't know back then the impact of would this technology impact the health of a future child or a baby, or, they measured, I remember them putting the pads and the jelly on my brain or my scalp to measure my brain waves and things like that. And so basically every time there was a new reproductive milestone in the world, people would want to talk to my family, which is very flattering and humbling. But at the same time, when you're a child, it was also a lot of pressure, right? It was a lot of pressure because I was acutely aware that I had to be well behaved. I had to be well spoken. I had to kind of be on my best behavior all the time. And as such, I grew up, we were chatting before this podcast started that I'm incredibly organized. Well, that stems from my need to I finally a couple years ago have let go of my perfectionist streak, but there's some parts of it that will always be with me. And the organization is one of them because I felt like I had to be this perfect thing and person. And I was also very aware that if I had come out not how everybody anticipated, and I was very small, there were, again, 41 years ago, ultrasound was not what it is now. I was only 5 pounds, 12 ounces. So they were worried, is this child going to have birth defects? Are we going to have to share the news with the world that it didn't work and she didn't come out okay? And I knew from a very young age, if that had been the case, certain aspects of reproductive technology in the United States probably would have been pushed back. I don't know, 10 years at least, I'm guessing. So it's a weird kind of pressure to grow up with, but it is also one that I do not take lightly. And my parents and I have always operated from a place of, how incredibly humbled we are to be those people, to represent hope in a way. And, it's really important to us. They could have stayed private. Nobody knows that the doctors actually said to my parents, you don't have to share your name. We can keep you private. And they felt very strongly no, people need to know her name. People need to know who she is and see her to understand that this is possible. And if sharing our story and losing some privacy happens, it will be worth it if we can help just one other couple or one other family. And so that's kind of just how I grew up.
In many ways, those of us who go through IVF now have you and your family to thank for being so open and for normalizing it and for not making it this scary scientific thing that could have horrible implications for your family or for your future kids. You stepped in and willingly at age 3 days to this role of poster child for what has become a movement. That's really astounding. I hadn't really processed that in preparing for this interview. Is there anything now at 41 you wish you could tell the doctors back then or your childhood self about what it's like to be a poster child or about what the world should have known then that they know now about IVF?
Oh man. I mean, I think the greatest gift that I was given was that the doctors Jones, lived so long and were in my life like grandparents, and I came to know them very well. And Dr. Howard lived well into his very late 90s. So I had a great relationship with him. And actually he counseled me when I was pregnant with my son on what to look for in a hospital. And so, all these kinds of things. I wanted to make sure I had, a level 3 NICU just in case and, all these things. So I feel like everything that I wish they knew, I was always very open and straightforward with them. And it was more of, I just wanted people to not be afraid to ask me questions. And I feel like hopefully that comes through in all the advocacy work that I've done, is that there are no dumb questions. There should be no question off limits. And I'll tell you, if I don't want to answer something, I'm not comfortable answering something, but I want people to have a forum and a place and an outlet to ask questions that they're scared to ask. So for example, early in my probably maybe 20s, people would constantly ask me, well, you were an IVF baby. Did that affect your fertility? Like, because your mother was infertile and you were born this way, are you going to be infertile? And spoiler, no, I had absolutely no problem having my son, but I was very aware of, if I needed assistance, what the options were. Yeah. And actually growing up, I naively, for many years until I was really old enough to understand, just assumed I would have an IVF baby of my own because that's how I got here. So like, why wouldn't I be born the same way? Right? Like That's just little kid thinking, right? So it was completely normal and run of the mill to me. And so, yeah, I think that was always the biggest piece is like, I'm just like everybody else. I just got here in a different way than a lot of people, but that's really it. There's nothing else that makes me, quote unquote special. I always joke, I didn't do the hard work. The doctors and my parents did. I just showed up. Right.
Yeah. Hey, so I want to talk a little bit about that because right now you're the way you say I'm not special. I'm just me. The way I got here was special. That seems like something you've had to share with people for some time. And I can imagine early in the days of IVF, the fear was around what's going to happen to these babies? Are they okay? And now there's some different fears. So let's talk a little bit about IVF as a industry, as a scientific option. We'll go all the way back. When you were born, I'm in Massachusetts. Your parents are in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is now sort of at the forefront of a lot of these fertility treatments. But at the time, it was illegal here. Why were these things illegal in states like Massachusetts? What was the fear? What was the legal precedence that was coming up at the time?
So I'll answer that question by telling you a story. So, because I think it demonstrates this pretty well. One thing people may or may not know about me is that I worked most of my career as a journalist, and particularly in the health and wellness field, as probably a shocker to absolutely no one. And for most of my career, I worked at the Boston Globe. And when right before I was born, there was actually a Boston Globe columnist who wrote an opinion piece that IVF would mean that we would have an army of designer babies which by the way, I hate that term. And I like everybody continues to use it and it just grinds my gears. But anyway, and that, this was an act of playing God and, picking and choosing and all these things. And then fast forward, I'm an adult and I am working with the same columnist who happened to write this opinion piece. And I walked into her office and I said, I know we know each other professionally, but you may not have connected the dots that I'm the same, baby that you wrote about, 40 something, however many years ago it was. 20, I think I was in my 20s at that point. So 20 something years ago. And we had a really frank discussion of like the impact of her words on my family. And I said, you have to think about it from the standpoint of my parents, which was they had desperately wanted to have a child. They kept encountering barrier after barrier after barrier, and her body would literally not cooperate past a certain point. And I was like, there was one thing that I am entirely sure of in this world, and it is how much I was wanted and loved by my parents. And I said, so think about that. All of these people that are going through whatever their path to family building looks like are going through it because they genuinely want and desire and care so deeply and feel that this is part of their being so deeply that, these are probably going to be some of the most loved children ever. Right. And she said, I had never thought about it as just two people wanting to, create their family. I was thinking about the technology. And I said, and that's the thing, right? Like that's the piece that I think people lose sight of in all of these arguments is, somewhere on the end of hatred is a family or a child who really exists in this world of love. And so to this day, like it is still very difficult. I've had people call me a child of the devil or, say I shouldn't be here. And that's, I have pretty tough skin, but that is not fun. That is not a fun thing to deal with. So I've always operated from a place of, listen, you can have your own opinion and disagree, but to actually remove an option or a choice for somebody, I think is just, probably the most detrimental thing we could do, because it's up to my parents could have chosen and they were actually going down the path of adopting before they figured out that IVF was even an option. But it was up to them to choose, right?
Mm-hmm.
To either move forward or not. And I think that's the piece, right? Is like, you may or may not agree with it, but at the end of the day, what they ended up with was a child, just like everybody else in the world wants to have.
Yeah, it's interesting because this playing God issue, this creating an army, I mean, that's pervasive thinking. We still get articles about that. We still get, I think there was one even last year about what if nations used fertility treatment and particularly the advanced technologies around what genetics you can screen for and test for to build the army of, really aggressive, jacked, tall, intense people. So that, I mean, just that fear sticks around so much so that there's now sort of this underground movement to try and ban or make IVF and other fertility treatments illegal again.
No, I know.
As you well know. And, I'm having a hard time understanding it. It's not a perspective I can relate to. Do you feel the added pressure of being the voice again about IVF 41 years later? Do you feel like there's this need for your advocacy in a different way as a result of recent legislature or recent posturing in the legislature, I should say?
So I'm going to tell you something that many people probably don't tell you often, but that pressure never left. We've been having these arguments since I was born. They've never gone away. They've just kind of slipped out of the mainstream spotlight, but they never left. They have never left. And that's why, the poor folks at Resolve, like I say poor because they're absolutely fantastic people. And I've probably, been talking with them for longer than they care to admit, right? About all of these issues since I was super, super young. And they've been fighting these battles since very early. And so have I. And that's the thing that people don't see, except for maybe my husband, because he has to hear me, about it. People don't see the nights that I sit at my kitchen table and I wait in a Zoom waiting room to testify in front of state legislatures or legislators or congressional sessions and, waiting hours to testify. And then maybe the discussion gets cut short or they can't get to the topic and I have to keep doing it over and over and over again. That's the stuff that I've been doing forever and has never left. Yes, it's come back into the media spotlight, but truthfully, the battle has never stopped in my opinion and in my view. And that's why, when people say, well, what can I do? I'm always urging them, join Advocacy Day, write the letters, make the phone calls, show up.
Yeah.
Because as somebody who, didn't have to deal with infertility and because I'm the product of IVF, but I didn't have to deal with it myself. I feel kind of this need and obligation to fight for those who are in the fight right now, right? That may not have the mental, the mental capacity because they're so focused on just where they are in their family building journey to add one more thing to the plate. I feel like, okay, you focus on your journey and where you are right now. And I'm going to keep fighting like hell because I feel like I need to.
It strikes me that you didn't choose to become a poster child. That was a product of luck, circumstance, incredible technology, a miracle, if you want to call it that. And yet you're choosing to continue the fight for 41 years. You're continuing to choose the advocacy to bear arms, so to speak, on behalf of those other families. And that's a really amazing thing to select for yourself, where the other options were sort of forced on you. This is a choice I think you're making. Do you ever get tired?
Of course. Of course I do. I get very tired. As I said, this is not a battle that has gone away, sadly. There are parts of it that have eased up. I think the stigma and, the conversation around family building has expanded, and it's more widely accepted now to talk about these issues, but it's never gone away. Of course I get tired, but I have chosen to continue to go forth because it's not lost on me, the stories I've heard since I was little. There was a very striking moment when I was 10, and we had gone back to the Jones Institute for what they had held every year at that point, which was a Mother's Day reunion, which meant all the babies in the program that were born would come together. The families would celebrate and, whatever. And I met this couple from Rhode Island who I'm still in contact with. And they had twins, babies, 1,000 and 1,001. And I was 10 and I had one in each arm. And it just was like this moment of, I'm an only child. I don't have any siblings, but I really feel like every IVF baby that was born before me, like Louise and Alistair and all those, and the Zoe Whelan's, who was a FET baby, and every baby that was born after me are like kin, right? And so I want to do everything I can to protect them and, hopefully lead a path and lead a charge and say, it's okay. I went through this. You don't have to fight this battle alone.
Wow. It's funny. I talk a lot about donor conception because my son is donor conceived. And so you get these people who come together and they have shared genetics.
Yep.
But you come together and you have a shared pathway, a shared birth story, so to speak. And I love that image. And I love that the number of people who share that birth story and who are part of your kinship are just growing exponentially. It's really special. When you think about the fight that you've been fighting and the current loud voices against IVF, are you more scared now than you were before about the future of IVF? Or is it all the same and it's just whether the spotlight, using a Boston Globe term, has been placed on it?
Yeah, I think I'm the same level of scared, unfortunately. But I think, it's that fear that motivates me and drives me forward, because I think if we all thought that everything was going to be sunshine and roses moving forward, we might ease up off the gas pedal a little bit. And we can't afford to. There's such a long way to go. And it's not just about the new laws proposed. It's about the laws that we've been fighting for since I was born to get passed. So, for example, I was born in Virginia. Guess what? Just a month ago, I was testifying to the General Assembly asking them to cover IVF because, spoiler alert, it's still not covered as an insurance mandate state there. And I was born there 41 years ago. And it was kind of this moment of like, guys, you were pioneers. You made this possible. You have this as history in your Commonwealth. And we're not there yet. And here I am as a grown-up asking you, begging you. So, it's all that stuff too. It's not just the newly proposed, the personhood bills and all those things. It's all the other stuff that we're still working on changing the tide on.
Let's name some of those things. If we weren't in a democracy and I were to grant you queen of the United States and you could do anything you wanted with regard to changing either our cultural norms or our laws and regulation with regard to family building, what might you change?
Oh man, if I told you my whole list, we could be here for another 6 months. So I'll give you my top hits. The biggest one for me is obviously access to care. We know there's a disparity. We are working hard to change it. It is very slow going. And, if I could just have one wish, it would be that, granting better access to care. The second would be, figuring out still a way to lower the economic burden of IVF. And part of that includes the access to care, right, through insurance mandates and other things. But by and large, just driving those costs down. And then I think the third thing that I would really change, and this is, kind of a very in the weeds and personal thing, is explaining all these options while children are really learning about their own changing bodies and reproduction. I mean, there's a story that I tell in my book about me being in 6th grade, and they separated the boys into one classroom and the girls in the other. And we had to talk about, sex and how babies are made and all this stuff. And the school nurse goes through her spiel, and, they show us some video and they explain how babies get here. And at the end, she looks at the whole group of girls at that point in the classroom and says, "Are there any questions?" And of course, I'm gregarious and precocious and all those things. And I raise my hand and say, "That's not how I got here." And then I explained IVF to the entire class because I felt it was important that they knew that there were other ways to come into this world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, the joke is like my poor parents got a phone call later from the school district because that wasn't approved to talk about. But from that point forward, every kid that was in elementary school with me was no longer shocked when they saw me on the TV news or in the newspaper. They just kind of understood like, "Oh yeah, I remember she talked about that's just the different way she was born than me." And it was like a non-starter and not a big deal anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's frankly, all of those things fit directly into my mission, but particularly the latter, which is that when you are either not aware of or afraid to talk about all the different structures and ways families come together, it makes it hard to create those families. It creates a lot of shame, or people feel like they have to hide their family building or whatever they've chosen. And it's funny because living in Massachusetts, which is a very liberal state, and has great healthcare and lots of access to things like IVF. I almost forget that IVF should be on that list. It's like, oh yeah, of course, IVF. Let's talk about some of those other things that are a little bit more unusual, a little less common or less talked about. And yet we have to keep the IVF front and center for several reasons. One is because so many of the families that are non-traditional in their family structure use IVF to come together. So it used to be that the way you had a baby was unusual. Now it's the style and the family structures.
Exactly.
And this is the tool that allows so many people to have their dreams come true and to have not just their dreams, but to enable incredible people to enter this world. If it didn't exist, we wouldn't have you. We wouldn't have so many other incredible humans. I'm preaching to somebody.
Yeah, no, it's true. And the other interesting thing that I always think about is with all these technologies, the more people that know about them and that talk about them, I think personally, because I've gotten a very unique front seat, to the industry as a whole. Like I work in the industry. I have worked in the industry for several years, and I have gone to those conferences, these massive conferences as like a 12-year-old where they're talking about, now we're back to the practice of putting singletons in. But I remember when that wasn't the practice, right? And it was like, well, how many do you want? How many eggs? Okay, let's do that. So I feel like the more people that have access and talk about these things, the industry itself gets better as a result of those conversations. Because the more, people who are utilizing these technologies raise questions and ask like, well, wait a minute, why do we do it this way? Or why isn't insurance covering this? Or how do I change the needle? Or how can we make this process less complicated? There are so many different organizations now that have popped up because a patient asked a question. Yeah. And that, I think, is what makes this so special, right? Is that we all can find little bits and ways to move the needle if we just keep talking.
I think that's right. And I think I saw somewhere that you do a lot of work around patient advocacy. And sometimes we as patients assume that a doctor knows everything, that they are the smartest person in the room because they have that degree. And the ability to ask questions and inform your own care and not just assume that the doctor is telling you, oh, you'll never have babies and therefore they're right because they're the doctor, or it has to be this way. You have to do it this way. But to seek alternative options or to ask the questions, it's so important. And I would say a handful of the stories, the success stories on my Stork'd podcast have come from people who said, I reject what this doctor is telling me and I'm going to go find somebody else, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And knowing the questions to ask, right? So it's very similar to, when I was looking at preschools for my son, my mother had run a preschool at that point in her life. And I was like, Mom, I called her up and I'm like, Mom, this is totally overwhelming. I was like, there's private preschools, there's public preschools, there's this kind of style preschool, there's this one, there's this. I was like, how do I make heads of tails of this? And what are the critical things that I should be asking these people when I go visit? And she, God bless her, wrote me a list of like, observe these things, but also ask these questions. And if these aren't the answers that they're getting or something akin to that, move on. And so I think even having some, now we see articles all the time on like, what questions should you ask your IVF doc when you're going through, or, all the things you need to know before you go through donor conception and, all these kinds of things that never existed before. And so just even having that volume of learning from those who went before you is a huge benefit that, 41 years ago, nobody had.
You had a piece of paper and a question mark.
Exactly.
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. I think it's amazing. Do you have a sense for where the industry is headed? For instance, one of the things that is a technological advancement just in the time that I've been doing treatments is that egg freezing has become normalized and the technology around how you freeze eggs is better. When I first froze my eggs, they were like, the data doesn't really work because the data came from women who were surrogates or donated their eggs. We don't have data on women who use their own eggs, right? So now we know we have data from women who use their own eggs. And there's this movement for more and more professional women to freeze their eggs younger. What other movements are you seeing? Where are we all headed?
Yeah. So what I think is very interesting now is that, particularly there are two things that kind of catch my attention. And they a little bit go hand in hand. So I obviously can speak just like you with donor. I can speak in a very deep way about the IVF. So I'm going to focus on that. So in the IVF world, what's interesting to me is we're starting to see a shift now of people that are utilizing IVF, not like my parents because they have to, right? Because they felt like it was their only option, but because they want to, because it allows them greater access to things like pre-implantation genetic testing and, those kinds of things. So the IVF industry itself is kind of exploding. And within that, there's like subfields that are also exploding, like the genetic testing market, which is just growing, almost faster than IVF itself, which is fascinating to me because people really want to handle on what disease risk there is. I remember when the first pre-implantation genetic testing was done and it was just for single gene. And that was back, believe it or not, in 1990. And so it's actually been around for a while, but it's taken a bit for it to kind of catch on, right? And become more mainstream. And so that's interesting to me that now, my son potentially could go through IVF with his partner in order to have his family and not be dealing with an infertility diagnosis like his grandmother, right? So that part of it is very interesting to me, that it is now kind of seen as a true alternative method as opposed to a necessary method and the only singular, kind of solution, as it were. It's really interesting.
Do you think, I'm going to talk out of turn, so you might want to educate me on this. I have heard a couple little things around there that while we know that the babies who are born as a result of IVF are healthy, wonderful, thriving kids, never want to take that away. That we know to be a fact.
Yep.
But there can be some risk to IVF in terms of I believe miscarriage rates might be a little higher and early labor and delivery might be a little higher and some of those things, like some of the impact on the mom and the carrying process and the delivery process. So there seems to be this push back to, if you can, trying to do a lighter or less intensive method, like an IUI or ICI or something like that. Is there any truth to that? What do you have to say about that sort of pendulum swing?
So, it's very interesting. Studies are always very interesting for me because I grew up reading them. And then I, in my career, because I was a health journalist, also read them with close scrutiny. And so there might be something there. However, I would push even harder and say, I wasn't part of those studies and I'm the oldest one here in the US. So you might be missing a data set, right? Like you might be missing a large chunk of the population here. And I have participated in studies in the past. Actually, there was a big study done by the Jones Institute. I think the last one that I participated in, I was in my late 20s, where they assessed us for all of those things. Do we have a higher, because now we're at childbearing age, right? Most of us at that point, because shortly after I was born, it was kind of like rapid fire succession of, baby from this particular clinic. And so they assessed all of those things. And it turned out we had the same deviations and risks as a typical population that got here through non-IVF methods. So, I think we'd have to do even more work. And I just, I don't know how big those study cohorts were, but I know I wasn't in them. So it makes me wonder, not to like toot my own horn, but I am unfortunately the oldest now here in this country. And then Louise is a couple of years older than me. She was born in 1978. So it's very interesting. And I don't think there's maybe been one or two studies that she's been involved in that we compare notes. Of course. As we're the only people in the world that could. So, it's a little bizarre.
Of course. That's so fun though, too. Oh, wonderful. Okay. So if you were in your parents' shoes, this is a really unfair question. I think I know where you're going to go. But if you were in your parents' shoes and you had zero information about this new scientific technology and we're just said, go to Virginia and make this happen and we'll see what happens, would you take that risk?
Only if it was the Joneses. Honestly, no, my parents have actually talked a lot about this or, previously, that they made the decision to go forward once they had a conversation with Dr. Howard and Dr. Georgiana Jones, because they just made them feel so comfortable and safe and protected. And, like no matter what happens, we're going to care for you, whether it's a great outcome or a terrible outcome. You are now part of our family. And I think that was critical in a, probably non-measurable, non-scientific sort of way, critical to the success that my parents had, because they secure and just like, we have the best team that could possibly be trying to do this and we trust them implicitly. So I think if, 41 years ago, if I were my parents, I probably would only make the leap if it were them or somebody like them.
It's something so important about feeling safe, feeling cared for, feeling like you respect the doctor you're working with. I mean, all that goes a long way in the psychology of doing anything. I have just a couple quick questions about genetic testing, because that's what you do professionally. And that is one of the future, you talked about it yourself, that many people are choosing IVF so that they can do genetic testing. Can you tell us a little bit about what genetic testing is all about these days? For those people who don't know, I feel like IVF is one of those more well-discussed, well-known concepts, but the genetic testing is a component of IVF that is a little foreign and very new. And as you said, rapidly growing. Yeah. So what are you testing for? How does the test work? What should we know about genetic testing?
Yeah. So the company that I work for, Genomic Prediction, we have this suite of testing called LifeView. And we actually have several different tests, and they test for various different things. So I talked about, way back in the 90s, the ability to test for single gene, some of those single gene abnormalities that we know are just really can be lethal, essentially. We test for things like that. We also can test for, like the chromosomal abnormalities, which can lead to a higher risk of miscarriage and things like that. But we can also, which I think is really interesting, on which side of the family it's happening. So is it a maternal or a paternal abnormality? That's one of our new tests can figure that out. And where I think that is so critical is, does it mean you're going to need donor egg? Does it mean you might want to think about donor sperm? It just opens you up to, again, options, right? It doesn't mean you have to take action necessarily. And what I think is beautiful about genetic testing is we arm you with the information and give you enough baseline education to understand what this information means. And then again, it's up to you to decide how to move forward. And so the more, in my opinion, the more information we can give you about the health of your eggs or embryos, I think the better. So, if turn the clock back again, right? There were two possibilities and here I am, and it was based on a beauty contest. Well, this is a different level of information that, looking back, if my parents had it, probably would have come in pretty handy, right? Like they lucked out because it was a 50-50 shot, but that's a scary prospect that they pretty much had decided that this was their singular shot and they were not going to do IVF again if it didn't work. But we know now that I am a little bit of an anomaly, right? Like it doesn't usually take one cycle and you hit the jackpot. It hits multiple, right? It takes multiple. So that's really what the pre-implantation genetic testing allows you to do, is to really stack the deck in your favor. So you can figure out, like, does this one have a better chance over this one? So, I always say I'm science adjacent, so I know just enough to be dangerous, but I'm sure you'll provide my ways to get in touch with me afterwards. But if anybody wants to learn more about the testing that we particularly do, they can go to lifeview.com and you can read about all of our tests. And obviously you can contact me as well. I'm happy to direct you to people who can answer questions about the science, behind it better than I can. But I think that's where, genetic testing has really become something that is part of a typical IVF cycle now. Because again, you mentioned egg freezing. Well, now we know we can freeze eggs. Now we can ship a little biopsy from those to test and see where we are, and that's been really fun and fascinating to watch, because I remember when it wasn't possible at all. I was not a frozen embryo. I was a fresh transfer. So here we go. Totally different, right? So yeah, it's a really fun and interesting field. And I think it just goes back to my personal mission of giving everybody as much information as possible.
That's awesome. Yeah. So here's a question I ask every guest, and you have actually answered it already in interesting ways. So it's not that you haven't already addressed it, but given how much you talk about family building, how much your family was shaped by the technology available at the time, IVF, and the relationships you have with other people who were born through IVF, how has that informed what you think about family? What is your definition of family?
Oh, man. I mean, my definition is so broad that it's really beautiful. I always say that family is really what you choose. And I think that means for me in so many different ways. It doesn't just mean the path you took to get to whatever that family looked like, but it also means the people you surround yourself with. In my case, it was two IVF doctors who were really like grandparents. And in other cases, it's, dear, dear friends who also happen to be IVF babies that feel like a sibling relationship to me. And so I think of them that even if our DNA says otherwise, right? So my definition of family is just massive. And I think that that's really lovely, because I think it's always been massive for me. It was never a shift for me. It's always been that way. And, right down to my nurses when I was born who put Jerry curl in my hair for my first press conference to spruce me up, their family. And so, yeah, it's a really incredible thing to feel like in some way everybody's family to me.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow. I love that definition. Thank you.
Of course.
So you mentioned it already, but where can we find information about genetic testing? How do we connect with you? Where's your book? Tell us all the ways to find your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so bad. I have to even look up. I'm most active on on Instagram. So the easiest way to get me is on Instagram. You can follow me on eJordan12. That's my Instagram handle. Or you can go on my website, ejordancarr.com. And there's a link there to buy the book if you want to do so. And then in terms of genetic testing, again, you can go on lifeview.com to get all the information. Or if you just want to ask some simple questions and you're not sure you're ready for a full-blown website, shoot me a message and an Instagram message and I'll connect you up to the right people. I'm happy to always be a connector. Hopefully people know that I'm always an open book, and I may not be speedy in my response because I get many, as you can imagine, I get a barrage of messages from patients and advocates on a daily basis, but I try to take time every Friday night and go through and clean out my DMs. So I will get to you, I promise. But yeah, I encourage everybody to reach out. It's one of my favorite things to talk with other people. So
as we mentioned, type A organized.
Yeah,
well, thank you. Elizabeth, this has been awesome. It's so fun to go back to the origins of this thing that made all of our family lives possible. So thank you for continuing to advocate, for choosing to be the voice of fertility and IVF, where you didn't have to keep choosing that, but we appreciate it. And for speaking with me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.